You think you know power? Let me show you what real power looks like. The courtroom buzzed with laughter. Judge Judy smirked from behind the bench, shaking her head in amusement. Across from her stood an elderly woman, wrinkled hands resting firmly on the table, silver hair neatly tied back. Judge Judy arched an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you lost? This is a courtroom, not a retirement club. Did you wander in looking for your grandkids?" More laughter erupted. Young lawyers exchanged knowing looks, and even the bailiff struggled to hide a chuckle. But Eleanor Lawson didn't blink. She didn't stammer, didn't shrink back. Instead, she slowly adjusted the lapels of her blazer, her sharp gaze locked onto the judge's. Then, in a voice calm yet commanding, she said, "I strongly advise you to choose your words carefully." The laughter cut off like a blade. A hush fell over the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Even Judge Judy's smirk wavered, just slightly. She let out a dry chuckle, masking the flicker of doubt behind her eyes. "Oh? And why is that?" Eleanor leaned forward just enough to make the judge take notice. "Because I've won more cases than you've ever presided over." Gasps rippled through the room. The stenographer hesitated, fingers frozen above the keyboard. The prosecutor stole a glance at Eleanor, suddenly realizing this was no ordinary case. Judge Judy's smirk vanished completely. Before we go further, drop your thoughts below, like, subscribe, and keep watching, because what happens next, you won't believe it. The cafe hummed with the morning rush, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the occasional burst of laughter. Near the window, two young lawyers leaned over their table, their expressions smug. "This case is already won," one of them said, stirring his coffee lazily. "That old lady doesn't stand a chance." His colleague chuckled, shaking his head. "Judge Judy is ruthless. She'll tear her apart before the first objection." They spoke with certainty, the kind that comes from never having been proven wrong. A few feet away, Eleanor Lawson sat with her tea, quietly listening. She didn't react, didn't turn to look. She simply lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and kept her expression neutral. But behind her steady gaze, something shifted. They assumed she was weak. They assumed she was outmatched. Eleanor carefully set her cup down, adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, and stood. She walked past their table without a word, stepping out onto the bustling sidewalk, the wind catching the edge of her coat as she moved. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't concerned. She was ready. Inside a dimly lit apartment, stacks of legal documents covered the surface of an old wooden desk. The soft glow of a lamp illuminated Eleanor's face as she flipped through pages, her pen gliding over lines of text, practiced precision. She worked in silence, scanning each document with the focus of a surgeon. Old statutes, precedents, loopholes. Nothing escaped her attention. The city outside never slept, but Eleanor had lived long enough to know that victory wasn't won in the courtroom. It was won here, before the trial even began. She reached for another document, eyes narrowing as she highlighted a key passage. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. They had no idea what was coming. The morning sun gleamed against the towering courthouse, casting long shadows on the stone steps. Inside, murmurs rippled through the grand hall as Eleanor Lawson stepped through the doors, her back straight, her stride unhurried. Heads turned, attorneys whispered, clerks exchanged puzzled glances. Who was this woman? Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her tailored blazer crisp. There was no hesitation in her step, no uncertainty in her gaze. She walked past rows of seasoned lawyers, past wide-eyed law students clutching their case files, past skeptical glances that silently questioned her presence. But Eleanor had no time for doubt, hers or anyone else's. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Judge Judy's eyes scanned the document, her expression shifting ever so slightly. The confidence that had once gleamed in her gaze dimmed as she read each line. The prosecutor leaned in, brows furrowed. "What is this?" Eleanor clasped her hands, her voice steady. "That, counselor, is a zoning exemption, one that has been legally in place for over 30 years. The prosecutor scoffed. "Impossible! This exemption doesn't exist." Eleanor tilted her head. "It does, because I wrote it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The quiet amusement that had once filled the room vanished in an instant. Judge Judy's gaze snapped up. "You're telling me you personally wrote this exemption?" Eleanor gave a small nod. "That's correct, Your Honor. 3 decades ago, when I served as this city's chief zoning attorney." A stunned silence followed. The young attorneys in the front row exchanged wide-eyed glances. The jury members leaned forward, murmuring amongst themselves. Even the bailiff, who had chuckled earlier, now stood completely still. The prosecutor took a step back, his lips pressing into a thin line. Judge Judy exhaled sharply, setting the document down. "That doesn't explain why this wasn't brought up before now." Eleanor met her gaze. "Because no one bothered to look?" Judge Judy narrowed her eyes. "If you were once the chief zoning attorney, why did you walk away?" For the first time, Eleanor's sharp, unwavering presence softened. She inhaled, exhaling slowly as she tapped a single finger against the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter. "Because I learned that justice doesn't always win." The words hit the room like a heavy weight. Judge Judy's expression flickered, just for a moment, just enough for Eleanor to see it. The courtroom, still in shock, remained silent. But Eleanor had already said all she needed to say. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Eleanor entered the courtroom, her heels tapping rhythmically against the floor. The air was thick with quiet amusement, polite, but unmistakable. From the bench, Judge Judy smirked. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man with an air of certainty, stood ready, glancing at Eleanor as though she were little more than an inconvenience. Judge Judy leaned forward, a hint of playfulness in her tone. "Shall we begin?" The prosecutor took that as his cue. Clearing his throat, he strode confidently toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a straightforward case." "Objection." The single word sliced through the room. A brief pause, then a ripple of surprise. The prosecutor turned, blinking in disbelief. "Excuse me?" Eleanor, still calm, still poised, folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Your argument is based on a false premise," she said evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Judy arched an eyebrow. "And what false premise is that?" Without breaking eye contact, Eleanor reached into her briefcase and pulled out a neatly folded document. She held it up for the court to see. "This." The prosecutor's expression shifted. His confidence flickered. Judge Judy narrowed her eyes, watching as Eleanor stepped forward and placed the document on the desk before her. Slowly, Judge Judy unfolded it. Her gaze scanned the contents. And then, just for a split second, her smirk faltered. A stunned silence gripped the room. The prosecutor stiffened, his hands clenched. Eleanor had just flipped the entire case on its head. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, and Eleanor stepped outside. The cool air hit her skin, but she barely noticed. Victory was hers, but it didn't feel like a celebration. She had seen the way Judge Judy hesitated, the way the prosecutor had paled when the truth unraveled. The case was over, but something lingered, an uneasy silence, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then the sound of tires rolling against pavement made her pause. A sleek black car pulled up at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the courthouse steps. The windows were tinted, but Eleanor already knew who was inside. Slowly, the back window rolled down. And there he was, James Calloway, the same sharp eyes, the same arrogant smirk, unchanged, except for one thing. He wasn't supposed to be here. Eleanor's finger curled at her sides, her heartbeat steady, but alert. Calloway had been disgraced, disbarred. She had seen to that herself. Yet here he was. Calloway leaned an elbow on the door, his voice smooth, calculated. "Still making trouble, I see?" Eleanor didn't blink. "Still breathing, I see." A chuckle rumbled from his chest, but there was no warmth in it. "You should have stayed gone, Eleanor." Her jaw tightened. "So should you." The air between them was thick, a past that had never truly been buried. Calloway tapped 2 fingers against the car door, tilting his head slightly. "We'll be seeing each other soon." Then, just as smoothly as it arrived, the car pulled away, disappearing into the city. Eleanor watched until the taillights vanished. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The city never slept, and neither did Eleanor Lawson. Inside her dimly lit apartment, she sat at her desk, scanning through files, case records, and old financial transactions. The glow of the desk lamp cast sharp shadows on her face. Across from her, Daniel, her young assistant, shuffled nervously through a pile of documents. "Calloway should be finished," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "Disbarred, humiliated, but somehow he's still standing. How?" Eleanor flipped open an old case file, one she hadn't touched in years. The pages were yellowed at the edges, but the name printed across the top was unmistakable. James Calloway. She traced a finger down the reports, stopping at a series of unaccounted transactions buried in financial records. "Because power never truly disappears," she murmured. "It just hides." Daniel leaned over, eyes scanning the documents. "These offshore accounts? They were never traced?" Eleanor exhaled. "Number because Calloway didn't move money the way criminals do. He used something else, something bigger." She slid another file across the desk, this one stamped confidential. The Haven Trust. Daniel frowned. "What is that?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "A bank that doesn't officially exist. It's a financial ghost. No paper trails, no records. It's where men like Calloway keep their money safe." Daniel paled. "And if his money is still there, it means someone kept it safe for him." Eleanor nodded, already reaching for her coat. "And I know exactly who that someone is." The small dive bar in Brooklyn smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. It wasn't the kind of place respectable bankers spent their time, unless they were hiding. At a dimly lit booth, hunched over a half-empty glass, sat David Langley, Calloway's former banker. Eleanor approached, sliding into the seat across from him. Daniel hesitated, but followed, keeping his gaze on the man in front of them. Langley barely glanced up, his hands shaking as he lifted his drink. "Whatever you're looking for, I don't have it." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice calm. "I think you do." Langley let out a bitter chuckle, rubbing his temples. "You don't get it. If Calloway knows I talked to you, I won't make it through the week." Eleanor studied him, then placed a document on the table. "Then you might want to tell me everything before he finds a reason to get rid of you anyway." Langley exhaled sharply, then finally muttered 2 words. "The Haven Trust." Daniel tensed. Eleanor didn't react. She already knew. "Who runs it?" she asked. Langley hesitated, glancing around as if the walls had ears. Then, in a low whisper, he spoke a name that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "Senator Richard Hale." A long silence followed. Daniel paled. "The Richard Hale? As in—" "The man who's been pulling Calloway's strings all along," Eleanor finished. Langley swallowed hard. "If Hale is bringing Calloway back into the fold, it means one thing. He looked her in the eye, his voice hollow. "Something big is coming." Eleanor sat back, the weight of the moment settling over her. Calloway wasn't just back. He was being placed back into power. And Eleanor was the only one who could stop it. A cold wind swept through Atlantic City, rattling the steel and glass buildings that lined the waterfront. Among them stood the Haven Trust, its sleek, unmarked exterior blending into the city like it had always been there, invisible yet powerful. Eleanor and Daniel stood across the street, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Daniel exhaled sharply. Breaking into a corrupt bank run by the most powerful people in the country? Great plan. Eleanor adjusted her gloves, her voice calm. "We're not breaking in. We're just walking through a door no one expects us to open." Daniel swallowed. "And what happens if they catch us?" Eleanor glanced at him, her eyes unwavering. "Then I hope you're a fast runner." The marble-floored lobby was eerily quiet, a receptionist typing away at a sleek, modern desk. Eleanor approached with a steady stride. The woman didn't look up. "Do you have an appointment?" Eleanor placed a small envelope on the counter. "I think you'll find my name on the list." The receptionist glanced at it, hesitated, then picked up the phone. After a murmured conversation, she looked up. "Take the elevator to the top floor. He's expecting you." Daniel shifted uneasily. "He?" Eleanor didn't answer. She already knew. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a massive office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At the center of the room, standing with his hands in his pockets, was James Calloway. His smirk was slow, deliberate. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Eleanor stepped forward, scanning the room. No security, no lawyers. Just Calloway. That meant one thing. He wasn't worried. She placed a thick file on the desk between them. "This is everything tying you and Hale to the Haven Trust. Offshore accounts, shell companies, money laundering. It's over." Calloway let out a low chuckle. "Over? Oh, Eleanor." He leaned forward slightly. "You should have stayed gone." Eleanor didn't blink. "So should you." The tension in the air crackled like a live wire. Calloway circled the desk, his voice smooth. "You always were the righteous type, always so sure that the law is some great equalizer. But tell me, Eleanor, where did all that righteousness get you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Right here, in front of you, exposing everything you built." Calloway sighed, shaking his head. "You're still fighting battles you can't win." Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what you said last time. And remind me, how did that work out for you?" Calloway's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniel, sensing the shift, took a step forward. "We're turning this over to the press, the courts, and every federal agency that still believes in justice. Your game is done." Calloway exhaled, staring out the window. "You know what your problem is, Eleanor? You still think the truth matters." Eleanor crossed her arms. "It does, and in a few hours, the entire world will see exactly who you are." For the first time, Calloway's jaw tightened. He knew. This time, she had won. The world woke up to a scandal it couldn't ignore. News stations ran the story nonstop. James Calloway arrested. Senator Richard Hale under federal investigation. The Haven Trust exposed as a hidden financial empire for corruption. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with murmurs and flashing cameras. Eleanor sat quietly, watching as Calloway, now in handcuffs, was led toward the defendant's table. His usual arrogance had been stripped away. No smirk, no confidence, just the weight of his downfall pressing onto his shoulders. Judge Judy adjusted her glasses, exhaling as she looked at Eleanor. No sarcasm this time, no smug remarks, just quiet recognition. She tapped her gavel once, her voice steady. "Miss Lawson, I believe I owe you an apology." Eleanor met her gaze with a small nod. She didn't need an apology. The truth had done its job. Outside, the courthouse steps were a storm of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Microphones were shoved in Eleanor's direction. "Miss Lawson, how did you pull this off? What's next for you? Are you going back to practicing law?" Eleanor ignored the noise, her gaze steady as she took in the city around her. It wasn't just about one case. It never was. Daniel, standing beside her, still looked like he was processing it all. His voice was quieter than usual. "I still can't believe we actually did it." Eleanor glanced at him, her lips twitching in amusement. "It's not over yet," Daniel frowned. "But Calloway's done. Hale is finished. What else is left?" Eleanor took a deep breath, watching the people move through the city, unaware of the battles being fought on their behalf. "Justice doesn't stop at an arrest, Daniel. It's a fight you keep showing up for every day." Daniel studied her, realization dawning in his expression. "You're going to keep fighting, aren't you?" Eleanor smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "I never really stop." She turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the streets of New York. Not into retirement, not into history, but into the next fight. Because justice is never given, it's taken. What do you think? Does justice ever truly win? Drop your thoughts below, like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the fight isn't over.